Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the next installment of Dan's Astrology. This is the first video that I'm recording in the year 2024. The topic for today is going to be Pluto's journey into Aquarius, which is a big deal for a number of reasons. Pluto will make its ingress into Aquarius actually at the same time the sun ingresses into Aquarius around January 21st, and that itself is kind of interesting, the fact that there is going to be a sun conjunction with Pluto at the moment of making the ingress. It's almost as if there's a kind of a symbolic gesture being made to highlight Pluto and to draw our attention to this particular transit. Now, when approaching Pluto in Aquarius, I just like to get one thing out of the way first, is that when approaching the topic of Pluto in Aquarius, it was tempting for me in some degree to try to sell it as being the Age of Aquarius, which it is not. And the whole idea of the Age of Aquarius is an entirely different concept to Pluto in Aquarius. Although, however, normally it would be easier to just keep these two things separate. But there is another thing going on that involves the planets Jupiter and Saturn, in that the way that the Jupiter-Saturn cycle works is that every 20 years or so there is this is in ancient astrology, before they found the modern planets. A Jupiter and Saturn conjunction was known as a grand conjunction, and the pattern of Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions basically happens in the signs of the same element for periods of around about 300 years, give or take. And recently, a few years back, at the end of 2020 into the early, if you actually just wind back the clock a few years to January 2021, there was a Jupiter Saturn conjunction around winter solstice that moved and then into Aquarius, and that sort of marked the beginning of this air cycle, this 300-year period of air where the next Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is going to happen in 2040 in Libra. You can look it up. And so the combination of a 300-year air cycle and then with this Pluto in Aquarius for 20 years. And then also keep in mind that Jupiter and Uranus are both going to be going through Gemini, although by the time Uranus is in Gemini, Jupiter will be well on to other signs. But we're going to end up having Pluto and Uranus in Gemini. Or no, sorry, Pluto in Aquarius and Uranus in Gemini, and in the midst of this Jupiter-Saturn air cycle, it's a lot of air going on. However, that is still not the same thing as the precession. The precession of the equinoxes is where they get the idea for an Age of Aquarius. And also you have to look at basically the planets, the themes of Pluto specifically, and just having one planet in Aquarius, even with all this other stuff going on, it's just not categorically what the Age of Aquarius has to do with the spring equinox point, which at one point in time perfectly matched up with Aries, and over long periods of time there's been a bit of a drift, and gradually the constellations, the actual stars you see in the sky, will not match the what we use as zodiac signs. And now, of course, some people will use this as a reason to criticize tropical astrology. Some people, there are certain kinds of archetypal astrologers who choose to leave out the zodiac signs entirely and strictly focus on the planets themselves, which, of course, it does eliminate. There's a certain degree of contention for some people around. I'll just lay it out there quickly, right? Like, I mean, I'm not going to spend too much time trying to dismiss the haters and naysayers of astrology in this video, but I am a person who practices astrology in the style of traditional Hellenistic astrology, and I don't use modern rulers, and I stick to a tropical system. I don't use sidereal. And the whole thing about, like, there's also certain things that I was considering too, like Pluto is, whether or not people consider Pluto even to be a planet, and there's a whole class of planets called Trans-Neptunians, some of which, especially there's the one called Eris, which stands for the god of chaos, or the goddess of chaos. And Eris is actually pretty much the same size as Pluto. So if you're going by size and it resembling a planet and all this kind of stuff, there are other, what would you call them? Subplanet, planetoid, dwarf planet. And some astrologers even get offended if you call things asteroids. I don't know, like it's a derogatory kind of term or something, right? I don't know, but I just wanted to get all this stuff out of the way first. I do respect the zodiac itself, and I think personally that it's a bit of a shame to, if we're going to practice astrology, that you've got the 7 traditional planets which are categorically represent something, and then because these planets are all visible with the naked eye, and then you have a system of seasonal associations which become the zodiac signs, which makes sense that the quality of Aries is a springtime quality, and the quality of Scorpio is a kind of around Halloween time. It all goes with the seasons, right? If we keep going on this sort of seasonal analogy, Aries is, even in traditional Hellenistic astrology, Aries is associated with youth, right? Like the baby lamb is a image associated with Aries since the ancient times. And then in contrast, we often use the metaphor of a young person who is aging and, goes through the summer and autumnal stages of life. And then once they're in old age, it's like, we're in the winter years of our life. And Saturn as a planet is associated with old age, and the signs Capricorn and Aquarius, traditionally ruled by Saturn, regardless of anything about a 12-letter alphabet, we can still see there's a process of youth with Aries and a youthful, springful kind of association with the old, wintry quality that comes with the Saturn-ruled signs. And of course, however, if you are in the southern hemisphere, this will be flipped. But there is a bit of a bias with astrology, that astrology was created with a geocentric kind of frame of mind. However, people may still practice astrology in the southern hemisphere and adapt it accordingly. And I'm not, maybe for certain people, sidereal makes more sense if you're in a different place. I don't know. But where I live in the northern hemisphere, and I choose to practice tropical astrology and respect the idea of using it less to do with the, thinking about the actual, not being so hung up on the stars themselves, but thinking about the planets in respect to periods of time and certain portions of the sky, and that when the sun is in this portion of the sky, it's spring. When the sun is in that portion of the sky, it's winter, and that these have rulership associations with the traditional planets, right? Now, with that all said, what makes the age, no, sorry, not the Age of Aquarius, Pluto into Aquarius specifically a big deal, something worth considering, something worth taking seriously, something worth paying attention to? Well, we all, another thing to consider here is also what I'm doing as an astrologer in terms of causation. That I'm not, by talking about the planets, I'm not talking about them as if they are causing things to happen. And no, I'm not a naturalistic astrologer in terms of arguing for some kind of, gravitational force that's exerted on the Earth or something like this. I'm basically just looking at symbolic resonances, symbolic associations. So there's something interesting with Pluto in that when it made its ingress into Capricorn, this lines up very nicely with basically the inauguration and election of Barack Obama and the preceding financial crisis, the 2008, subprime mortgage crisis is what I'm talking about, and the bank bailouts. And if you remember, shortly following that, we had things like Occupy Wall Street, all this. Now, the thing is, certain things about this, what I was talking about, the 12-letter alphabet, is there's a habit of, when you're talking about Capricorn, to derive its meaning as something to do with the 10th house. If you do this, Aries is 1, Capricorn is 10 thing, and then the 10th house is the house that rules career, right? So there's this thing about Capricorn as the ladder climber. Like, you take the goat, the climbing goat, and it's now a career-oriented goat that wants to climb ladders and journey toward, success and, domination, and or being active or something like this. And this is one thing that I have personally been trained out of, not to use the 12-letter alphabet. However, there is this sort of pattern. I'm finding it tricky because I am reading a bunch of astrology books that were written while the 12-letter alphabet was still popular. And, for example, I've been reading Liz Greene's book on Neptune. And one of the things that she was interesting is that I'm reading right now the part of that Neptune book where she talks about Rajneesh or Osho. I actually mentioned him in my last video when I was talking about cults, right? But apparently, she was saying that there was this shift in the 80s when Pluto was in, this is Neptune she's writing about. She was talking about when Neptune was in Sagittarius. She was talking about how there was a rise of cults, cult leaders, people being gurus and stuff like that. And then, which I wasn't even, I was born with Neptune in Capricorn, so I was too young to really, be cognizant of these things at the time. But apparently when Neptune was in Capricorn, you started to see more of this thing that was like corporate mindfulness, or, businessmen, how to use meditation as a form of stress relief to make you more efficient in business, right? Meditation with a purpose in mind that will improve your life, and you can see outcomes in the office, in the boardroom, or whatever, right? Now, the thing about this is that, it kind of goes off this thing that if it's Sagittarius' ninth house, it's all about the mystical, philosophical Sagittarius, and then 10th house is the Capricorn, which is getting down to work and make money and be serious, right? And what happens if you remove those associations and say we're not going to use the 12-letter alphabet? Does it still work? Well, in a way it actually does still work, because Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, is a sign of teaching and of growth and stuff, like expansion, and also could go with those things like travel or whatever. Jupiter and being generous and wanting to share your knowledge and all this kind of stuff. And then Saturn in Capricorn, if anything about Saturn and Capricorn, if you think about it, I think it still in some way kind of works for the working world, in that I think that when I think Saturn, I think of something that is more like putting on a uniform. There's a kind of a adherence to these strict kind of rules in a way that almost feels kind of militaristic, like you're kind of in this kind of rank and file system of organization. And I think that or it's also dealing with Capricorn being an earth sign, dealing with the material reality at hand, whereas Sagittarius may be more concerned with more kind of lofty spiritual things or whatever. Capricorn is more about dealing with, I find this interesting because I've been reading a lot of Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze had Jupiter in Capricorn, right? So it's like the planet that wants to be a philosopher, that wants to teach, is now in Capricorn, where it's in its detriment, where it is more concerned with material things. And so Gilles Deleuze, a Jupiter in Capricorn guy, ends up having a very material oriented philosophy, because he in what makes Deleuze interesting is that oftentimes he seems very abstract, but when he'll say, there's what I'm saying is not conceptual at all. I'm talking about like gazelles running from leopards or cheetahs or something like that on the Havana. It's like this is we're talking about like animals' life or death survival. This is not like cognitive, some abstract thing. This is you run from the predator stuff, right? There's but you can take these ideas and I don't know, he can take them into a certain realm that gets kind of hard to follow or abstract. I'm not going to get into Deleuze too much in this one, right? But that is as we proceed then from Capricorn into Aquarius, there's something about Aquarius which is more to do with the social contract, or the kinds of, rather than being about the kind of materiality as associated with an earth sign, we're talking about an air sign, which has to do with, if you think, so take something like work, right? Like with work, you are, on one hand, you could look at work from the position of materiality. You are making a contribution by using your muscles or using your brain muscle to push some physical objects around for somebody else to do some sort of productive task, and then that's your contribution or something, right? In Aquarius, it's looking more at the realm of this being a kind of a social arrangement that you have to like sign a contract, you have to negotiate your wages, you have to how does this fit into the broader system of social relations, the structure of our society, right? And the question is, that structure something that is just fixed, or is that the structure that can be improved? And because of the position of Aquarius being a winter sign where the light is growing greater, there's a will to improvement with Aquarius, right? And however, when we factor in Pluto into the situation, Pluto is a planet often associated with things that are destructive, that are sometimes, you could call it transformation. You call it death or renewal or something like this. I often, the thing about transformation, I'm starting to feel like it's often sort of like a kind of a euphemism these days, right? Where people, like, it sounds nice when you say, oh, it's transformation. It's not like, the like a terrifying shock or trauma that makes you do something different, or like there's and what the thing too is that if I'm going to be making these astrology videos, I'll lay it on you straight. I was doing some research because I thought it was worth looking into. When exactly has it been since Pluto was last in Aquarius? Which, of course, just jogged my mind. Everybody was talking about or all the astrologers anyways, it was the Pluto return of the United States recently. And so what I mean by that was that 1776, the Declaration of Independence, that thing, the 4th of July, when that happened, Pluto was in the late degrees of Capricorn. The United States declared itself independent from the British colonies. And obviously, following that, there was the American Civil War. And at the same time, you also had in France, they had the French Revolution and the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution. And of course, there was this kind of thing about throwing out the monarchy, the establishment of democracy, and the change and the transformation. But obviously, it was destructive. Obviously, it was violent. And there's something about Pluto, which is usually associated with kind of some of these negative things, and I'm not making this video with any sort of like trying to provoke any, like, Lord knows there's enough conflict, there's enough in the world already that I don't want to try to provoke it by making suggestions in astrology videos. But that was when Pluto was last in Aquarius, was a period for approximately 20 years from around 1780 to the beginning of the 1800s. And there's certain other things going on because, as we know, the Industrial Revolution kicked into gear sort of around this time, maybe a bit after, but it was sort of like this. I mean, I have to also admit, I was just doing some research on Wikipedia. At this point in time, maybe we will go to college or university to take some history courses, right? Maybe I'll do some, get more confident as a historian. But the Wikipedia article was suggesting that this particular period of time was a kind of a transition where you had what was known as the Western Enlightenment or the Renaissance kind of in the rearview mirror, and the scientific revolution looming over the horizon, kind of kicking into gear with things like steam power, and there was also sort of playing around with hot air balloons at the time. So there's kind of it's kind of funny because like there's almost kind of like a steampunk kind of feel, I think, with Pluto and Aquarius. Although I think that the whole period of time where the people draw for inspiration for steampunk is a lot bigger than just that 20-year period. It sort of marks the beginning of this time, right? But there's nonetheless this sort, like, then it kind of brings me back to this idea of the Age of Aquarius, or this idea of the New Age or something like that. And that there was a period of time where after one of the things that kickstarted the Western Enlightenment was that, they only had so much of these ancient texts by Plato, and they'd found a bunch of stuff. They also found the Corpus Hermeticum, and there was a kind of a renewed interest in both the occult and the sciences. Or like there was this kind of thing where, you probably heard of this, how even Isaac Newton was a bit of an occultist. There wasn't such a division between science and magic or whatever. But with all these sort of advances or breakthroughs in science and a better understanding of things, people were basically expecting that there's all this sort of spiritual stuff, that we were going to find out about spiritual stuff as well, right? We were going spiritual. There wasn't going to be a division between the, we were going to make scientific breakthroughs and sort of reconcile the differences between religion and the secular worldview, and have a kind of a new age of enlightenment where we had more conscious awareness of all these kinds of things. But what has tended to happen, I think especially with once you got into the World War I and World War II, was that it shook people's moral foundations, and it was kind of like science had kind of just run amok, right? And that there's also certain things that happened with the Industrial Revolution, where before there's certain things also. But before I get too far with this, there's certain things that happened along this time where, if you think about, let's just rewind what I was saying about the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the Civil War and all this kind of stuff that followed, is that basically what we talk about in terms of a political compass, right? Left wing and right wing was basically came about during this time in relation, for respect for the French, it was like getting rid of the monarchy and moving away from that into something different. And that if you were the more revolutionary or the more democratic or the more moving away from the monarchy you were, the more left-wing you were. And then the more you were trying to put the brakes on that kind of progress, the more that you were trying to retain the old social order, that was considered to be conservative or right-wing. And there is this whole thing about the connection between France and America that you all know with the Statue of Liberty and all this kind of stuff, but that it would basically came about in respect to these two countries and a new form of politics that was taking shape. And now the whole thing is, like I mentioned before, for some reason I recorded a video that I just decided to live stream on Facebook a while ago. More recently, I decided to take this video down, maybe even for silly reasons, because I was using a different computer, I had a different camera, my hair didn't look very good, I felt it was kind of an awkward video. But one of the things that I was talking about is the idea of being more politically neutral. But the thing is, at the base, there are basic principles that I believe in, that I would call myself a leftist, I guess, but there's something about this particular moment in time and understanding what Pluto in Aquarius means, and just looking around at the social climate. And I don't know if it's because of there's this thing going on that people call the culture war. And, there's like, I have this sort of basic inclination that I would rather stay out of the culture war and just like not get involved in it. But I don't know if like it's one of these things that just like everybody's implicated in the culture war. There's no way out. Or there's this whole thing though where, if you socialize, if you are not just living in your own bubble world, if you're interacting with other people, there is a kind of ire that has been drawn to these people who are considered to be like well-meaning white liberals who see politics in terms of like having all the right opinions, which isn't to say I'm not in, this isn't even from, you could, at the basic of having the basic premise of having a good opinion or having a bad opinion, they could, for all intents and purposes, these could just be, this is a good opinion to have. There's nothing, problematic about it, right? This going with the language, I guess, of that kind of politics. But there's this kind of thing where it's like, you could be what people said about like, I don't know, like you can go on there and kind of apologetically say all these things about like, other groups of people, and agree and have all the right points of view. And then, but then or then people who don't say that are canceled or something like that. And so there's also this kind of upset about policing, or it like basically it becomes like a politics that's all about of just being in conformity with this. Like there's been certain, like it's almost as if there's been certain battles that have been won, that have been like, there have been battles that have been won, and so that this is an appropriate point of view to have about things, and that anything that is a different point of view is inappropriate and is outside, you can't even talk about it, right? And there's something about the in recent times, Slavoj Žižek was talking about the ball crusher, right? In that, like, that we have there's this kind of we live in a time now where men can't talk about anything, or else you're a mansplainer, but you can buy torture devices for your balls and basically submit yourself to this kind of like ball torture or whatever, right? Or like basically to be in the world and feel like you can't say anything, or you can't have an opinion, or you can't talk about anything because the leftists have ran off with your balls, right? I think that sort of gets toward part of the issue with the changing political climate. There's also this whole kind of thing of like being overly apologetic for being privileged, right? Or that I'm in such a comfortable position with my privilege, and I'm not subjected to all these hardships that other people are. But it's kind of like, and just having to do this sort of like, before you say anything, you have to self-flagellate yourself, and you can't, you have to sort of, or I don't know. There are also a politics where, I don't know. I mean, there's this whole thing that there's all the identity politics and stuff like that, where it could be like, there's another thing where, if I have a disability, there's this whole thing about whether there are such things as like invisible disabilities, or if all disabilities are visible, or like, if you are I don't know, I'm kind of getting off track with all the identity politics stuff. The main thing is that like, if you have do you have to try to, do you apologize for being of a certain identity group, of being male, of being white, of being like, I can go walk around and I don't have to feel physically intimidated because I'm a man and I'm white, and I can just walk around like I own the place, right? And so like, do I have to like apologize for that, or should I take this as a perk and go, well, no, I'm just gonna do what I want. Nobody's gonna bother me because I'm a white male guy, right? And everybody, and that I don't know. Or do I have to be like, find whatever there is that is different about me and be like, look, I'm really kind of like a queer weirdo who deserves your sympathy, and please give me some kind of extra allowance to be different, because, you know, I can make an argument for something vague like neurodiversity or something like that, which is sounds like it says something, but really it's kind of vague, and it doesn't really say anything good or bad. It's just you're different and you need to be accommodated or something, right? I'm kind of bored of that sort of thing myself. And maybe I'm getting off track with all this. What I think I wanted to say more specifically is this shift in politics where there, like, I mean, you could look at something else, even like environmentalism, right? That here where I live in British Columbia, there is a Green Party, which, to be honest, it doesn't have very many seats, but it's at least got a couple, you know, we get a couple seats in, that is enough to have the balance of power, right? Where you have the left-wing NDP government forming a coalition with the Green Party, and there's this whole kind of thing about a political spectrum where you have left-wing and you have right-wing, and you have something like the Green Party, which makes their point of distinction around environmental issues, but they don't want to be anti-business or anything like that. So there's something about the Green Party where prior to that, the spectrum in which you analyze politics is between the progressive and conservative, authoritarian, libertarian, but there's no axis on there for environmentalism. And actually, there's a certain point of contention being that if the left wing is the Workers' Party, and that if the left wing, you know, would previously seek its support base for people like, let's say, miners or something like that, that miners are getting sick working in the coal mines, or that they're out of work because the mining industry has fallen apart or something. There's the working class, you know, or here we have stuff like the forestry industry. There's a whole bunch of people who have jobs chopping down trees, you know. Is it better for the workers to cut down more trees, or is it better for for them to not clear cut all our forests and, you know, conserve the environment? These things you may be able to do more social, you know, there's certain points of tension where the rights of the working class may be at odds with the environment and so on. And so certain vectors such as environmentalism are just really not on the map in terms of this political system that was devised before the Industrial Revolution. I think that's the main thing too, is that when this political system came about, it was on the heels of the Western Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution changed the shape of the whole landscape. And so there's certain issues where people are talking about the technocracy. There's certain issues that that don't map onto left and right very well, right? There's certain issues like, and by technocracy I don't mean like a class of, you know, some people may talk about there's a ruling class. It's not democratic anymore. It's a bunch of scientists, and the scientists have an objective view of what the right thing to do is, and if that's the case, why leave it to a vote? Just do what the scientists say, kind of thing, right? And that we shouldn't use a pretense of democracy. More people, you know, it could be like the scientists say that global warming and climate change and climate crisis are a kind of apocalyptic emergency, and that, you know, Pluto being this death rebirth thing, that could be a factor, right? That wasn't there when Pluto went to Aquarius back in the 1780s, back right after the Declaration of Independence. There's a whole different set of circumstances that are asking to be recognized by a political system that just doesn't have a way of mapping them out, is kind of what I'm saying, right? And on top of this, the way that the current political system has gone in terms of identity politics. I don't know. I think, I don't, in some way, I'm not trying to disagree with left-wing identity politics, but I have to admit, it does often feel like, as if you are just like a white male, heterosexual, and there's this kind of thing that's like, if you are, there's no, there's no point in having like a straight pride parade. I'm not one of those guys. You don't want to do like, white power or anything like this. But basically, there's a certain climate, social climate, where we're going to give the people who are previously been overlooked, right? That there's this whole idea that like history has been dominated by white men, culture has been dominated by white men, and now there's this kind of new era where we're going to give different voices a chance to be heard, right? This doesn't necessarily mean that all the voices necessarily say the same thing, but there's also, what I'm trying to say is there's this sort of like, the fact that our system of politics came out of this certain cultural moment where Pluto entered Aquarius after the American Civil War, after the French Revolution, and we developed a system of politics in respect to that form of relations that was there at that time. There's a certain question that I have living in a multicultural neighborhood in Canada, a diverse range of different immigrant populations, is that when we're talking about being progressive or conservative, that if you are conservative but of a different culture, is that actually the same kind of conservative? Like, if like a British person is conservative, a Tory, and if somebody who is an immigrant from China has an idea of being conservative, is that even the same idea of what conservative means, right? Because this is a complete, like, it could be, these people coming from a completely different circumstance, a completely different kind of politics, right? And they'll do this whole thing where there's this rhetoric around also like, fascism being far right and communism being far left. Is it even accurate to say that Chinese communism is left-wing? Right? Especially now that, China has become this sort of manufacturing capitalist, they make all, they make whatever Nike stuff in China. This isn't like, people wearing like the green outfits with the little red stars and just having government rations or something like this. This is a communist country that fully participates in capitalism. Does this even map onto what our idea of communism is supposed to mean, right? And then I don't know. There's these kinds of things. I'm basically have this sort of, when I'm trying to understand what Pluto and Aquarius is, what I'm realizing is that there's a sort of idea, and not to completely dismiss the concerns of the left wing or anything like that, but there's this kind of general atmosphere out there where, it could be that the whole thing that's happened since Donald Trump got in, and the alt-right and the resistance to the whole culture war that goes on, that a lot of people are basically just fatigued by that, or that they're looking for some other way to define themselves, or they're just feeling limited by that paradigm of understanding things, and that there are certain issues that don't map onto that paradigm. But like, for me, I'm just thinking that, like, isn't it interesting that all that came about a whole Pluto cycle ago, and that Pluto being a planet that has to do with these transformations, this death rebirth process, this sort of like the death, rebirth, renewal. And also Aquarius being this sort of drive to improve things, that there is this sort of sense that we draw up these maps, we draw up these systems, but there's a certain thing like astrology in contrast. Like if you look at a political compass as something it's a plane that's divided into 4 quadrants, right? And similarly, you can look at the astrological system as being a plane divided into 4 quadrants. But you've got the division between the horizon, what's above the horizon, what's below the horizon, and what is the east of the midheaven and what is west of the midheaven. And so you've got your own quadrant system in astrology. You've got a system of 12 signs and all this kind of stuff. And you've got this system that goes back thousands of years. Something left over from ancient times, and something that has also been used cross-culturally. It's not just been used by white people. It's been used by the Arabs. Arabic astrology essentially uses the same system, and Vedic astrology or Indian astrology uses a sidereal zodiac. But other than that, I would argue there's more in common than there is different about Vedic astrology, right? And that these systems go back thousands and thousands of years, and that they sort of anchor us into a system of meaning making or understanding the world, which is, I'm not saying it's completely eternal, but it may be indicative of a greater order to things than what has been constructed within, the time frame of before we've had we can have things like industrial revolutions, where there are whole circumstances of social relations, of politics can be incredibly transformed within the period of a few hundred years. And in this world of things always changing, of going through these changes, we have to redraw our maps. We have to come up with new agreements of basically like social contracts, right? Of how things work. And I think that Pluto into Aquarius, I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be a civil war, just because Pluto was in Aquarius during the American Civil War. But it's a time of change. It's a time of a new kind of politics. And it's not this, I'm not being just an optimist, a naive optimist saying that this is the age of Aquarius. But that there is something maybe a bit troubling or concerning about the nature of Pluto itself. When then, in the broader scheme of things, it'll be also, in terms of also just being concerned about Pluto and Aquarius, I basically see it as like the 2 Saturn signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, kind of go together. And so, I don't necessarily think it's going to be any more difficult than Pluto in Capricorn has been. However, there is something about it where, if you consider the fact that this is a 20-year chunk of time, and that it's been so long since the last time Pluto's been in Aquarius, that obviously in our lifetimes, we don't, human beings don't live for a whole Pluto cycle. And so there's something about what the planets stand for in terms of working out karma associated with these signs, where if you use whole sign houses, there's a certain process of Pluto having gone into Capricorn in 2008, and then Pluto going into Aquarius now that it's 2024. We already had a preview of it last year. And like I'm saying, it's not that Pluto causes things to happen, but that it's a omen or a sign that has symbolic resonance with what's going on, that we may be able to contemplate it and divine some insight into the nature of things. But it's not that Pluto causes this stuff. There's something going on where, if you look particularly at the generational thing, that I have said before, I've decided, I'm not keeping it a secret, although it's one of these things that I think as a lot of millennials might find kind of embarrassing, that I am in my 30s, and right now I'm living with my mother, who's an aging widow, and my mother was born in the 50s. She's a baby boomer. She was born with Pluto in Leo. And so during this 20-year period, by the time Pluto leaves Aquarius, my mother will be around 90 years old. So it's not a guarantee that we don't know when my mother... I'm not going to do these astrological timing techniques to figure out when exactly, try to predict when my mother's death is going to be, but it's one of these things that is just there with the planets and with the natural life expectancy, that it could very well be that Pluto in Aquarius during this 20-year period at some point in time will have to deal with the death of a lot of different baby boomers. But in my own sense, there's this whole issue about my mother and the house that I'm living in. And then I myself was born with Pluto in Scorpio. So for me, it will be Pluto square Pluto. For my mother, it will be Pluto opposite Pluto. And so the different generations will be experiencing this transit in different ways. If you were born with Pluto in Libra, it will be Pluto trine Pluto, right? But there's a sort of changing of the guard. There's a certain changing of the sort of how we structure our reality, and there's going to be a lot of changes going on. In terms of, I'm more actually concerned about what happens when Saturn and Neptune go into Aries, then Pluto into Aquarius. I don't want to be alarmist or anything like that, but this is another thing that I wanted to, this is a longer video, I have to admit, and I'm recording earlier in the morning than usual. I just wanted to say one more thing, though. I had one other idea that I haven't put into this video, and that is that when Pluto made its ingress into Capricorn back in 2008, I am a traditional astrologer, so one of the things I pay attention to is where is the ruling planet, right? The ruling planet, Saturn, in 2008 was making its transit in Virgo. And so when Pluto ingressed into Capricorn, its ruling planet was in Virgo, and there was a trine aspect between Saturn and Pluto, meaning that the changes Pluto was making in Capricorn were very fast and fluid, and that whatever house was represented by Virgo was somehow related or connected in through this trine aspect with reception between Saturn and Pluto at that time. And what we're dealing with this ingress of Pluto into Aquarius is something fundamentally different, because Saturn is in Pisces, and if you make if you use the traditional aspect system, from one sign to another is what we call an aversion, or a state of not seeing. Basically, it's like a blind spot. So this is one other important thing I wanted to throw in here, even if this is at the very end of my video, that Pluto in Aquarius will be ruled by Saturn in Pisces. And this gives this Pluto in Aquarius a distinct feel that is, for one thing, it's going to have a more watery Pisces quality than normal. It's also going to have the influence of Neptune when Saturn makes its conjunction to Neptune this year. This is going to be connected, but in such a way that it's going to be in the blind spot. It's going to represent a kind of unconscious area, right? And if you think about what Pluto stands for, Pluto often stands for like the id, right? Like these unconscious drives, or the shadow, or that which is not appropriate or acceptable, which is basically repressed, which has to be contained in a kind of like an underworld, right? And so there's all this sort of like taboo, inappropriate, and what I was talking about in terms of politics, in terms of like whatever. I don't even like talking about it. That's what I'm kind of getting at, is the thing about identity politics and cancel culture and having the appropriate opinion, or else you're just canceled. I mean, the other thing about I want to say about cancel culture, just to be clear, is that there's all, if some, like, I don't think anybody's arguing against people like Bill Cosby, right? Like, Bill Cosby date raped women, and I don't like this whole thing of like, if you find out that a celebrity is essentially just a brazen date rapist, it's kind of gross. And then, I mean, I guess you could make this argument that this person should still be allowed to have like a TV show or something, or write books or something like that, and not be censored. But I think it's still a kind of a valid concern that it all depends maybe what exactly the person did. Like, maybe we should, like, this whole thing about like Kevin Spacey. Like, if we find out that Kevin Spacey has some sort of ties to Jeffrey Epstein or something like that, or that Kevin Spacey has some moral indiscretion, does that mean we have to like burn all our Kevin Spacey's DVDs or Blu-rays? Not burning, or we have to basically, we're never going to watch this stuff again because we found out one of these actors is kind of a creep or something. I don't even want to single out him, but he's an example of these kinds of people. Like, there was a time where Kevin Spacey was regarded very highly, and then he fell from grace, and there's this kind of cultural thing going on of the building people up and then watching them fall and being all like, oh, that celebrity is really just a scumbag and all this kind of thing. Or there could be things about like, somebody says the wrong thing and they get canceled or whatever. There's all this, it's indicative of Pluto, because Pluto has to do with this, like, the thing that you cannot say, right? The thing that, regardless of making an argument saying that it's not to argue that it isn't wrong, or that whether or not it should be omitted, but this very act of taking something and exiling it, making something an exile, making something that's been omitted, or even something, or this idea of ghosting, like the idea of just like, and I have to admit, there's people that I don't want to talk to anymore. There's people that I have stopped talking to, but this idea of like, it's over. This is this relationship, this friendship belongs to the underworld now. It doesn't belong amongst the land of the living. It's gone through its death process. It's all very Pluto, right? It goes with this climate of Pluto and this idea of Aquarius wants to improve things, right? And that people are going into this. People are kind of fed up with this system of exiling people, of canceling people, or also just remove. Men now have to have their balls cut off effectively, because if men have a voice, if men have something to say, if men have an opinion, it's either mansplaining, or or if you offer any other variation to what has been accepted as the status quo, you deserve to be told off in a very basic kind of being treated by a kindergarten teacher, like, now Johnny, don't you know that this is a bad thing to say because this, and you shouldn't say. And so I'm not even, maybe they're right. Maybe there are certain things that are there are certain opinions, there are certain ways of looking at the world which are past their expiry date, which are like the thing in the back of the fridge which has gone moldy that you've forgotten about. And that Pluto in Aquarius can be very much like this. You have to clean out the fridge and take out the trash and all this kind of stuff, right? What I'm trying to say, though, is that I kind of got off track. During the initial ingress of Pluto into Aquarius in the first year, Saturn, it's the ruler of Aquarius. Keep in mind, I use traditional rulers. I'm using Saturn as a ruler for Aquarius, that Saturn is going to be in aversion in the blind spot of Pluto. So there's going to be this whole domain of stuff that is not seen, that is just omitted, that is like either a secret or something like that. And then watch for, it'll be a few years. Well, I don't know. When is this exactly going to happen? I'm going to have to check my dates. But when Saturn and Neptune make their ingress into Aries, what's going to happen is that because Aries has a sextile aspect to Aquarius, that Pluto in Aquarius will be aspecting, will be seeing Saturn, its ruler in Aries, conjunct Neptune. And honestly, there's something about this that I'm more concerned with because Saturn is in its fall in Aries, and when you put Saturn in its fall in a conjunction with Neptune, I don't want to know what that looks like. I think this is gonna be a mess. I don't want to sow seeds of, because we have to live through this and we have to create the situation the best we can, but the influences might be tricky. But at least at this point in time, there will be a dynamic where what is being covered up, what has been unconscious, will be brought to the surface, perhaps in a shocking and uncomfortable way when Saturn and Neptune enter Aries. And a lot of what I'm doing as an astrologer, regardless of whether I'm making videos for YouTube or just writing in my own private journals, is that I'm looking at the long term and trying to prepare myself for what this transit is going to mean for me personally, and what kind of changes do I have to make in my life to get ready for these transits that are going to happen a few years from now. And the symbolic thing about why I'm emphasizing this thing about the aversion between Saturn and Pisces and Pluto in Aquarius is that by doing the astrology, it illuminates something which is basically going to be a blind spot for a period of time, right? And that this is the process what Carl Jung said about making the unconscious conscious, right? Is basically using astrology to give us a insight into these blind spots, to be more aware of them, so that when the astrology indicates more of a coming into consciousness. It's not going to catch us off guard. We're going to see it coming, and we're going to have made the steps in advance because we have the gift of foresight. Okay, so this has been another long one. But yeah, I mean, this is going to be a 20 years of Pluto in Aquarius, give or take. So why not do a hour-long video for it? It's also the most significant, one of the most significant transits happening this month. So it was just on the top of, if I was going to do an astrology video, this was what was on my mind. For those of you who've been able to watch this whole thing, or if you've skipped through parts of it and made it to this far, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting my astrology channel. Happy New Year. Please like and subscribe. And we'll see you again. Have a good one. Thank you very much.